Hello. Oh, great. We are in good shape. This fellow right here is not Patrick Harding. So you see before you some of the sassiest and snarkiest and smart people in the space. So we're going to try and entertain you for the next 25 minutes on this intersection between blockchain and identity. We have 4 panelists that I will not introduce because we've got just such a little bit of time, but I will give them a chance to do an introductory statement of no more than 1 minute about what they would like you to know about the then of blockchain and identity. Mr. Fields.
Okay, so when I look at the Venn of blockchain and identity, I think on some level you do have to think a little bit about Bitcoin and what that enables. And so the Bitcoin blockchain is an architecture that enables the self-custody of digital assets. And so when I look at the intersection of blockchain and identity, I think what are bearer instruments related to our identity that we make custody today. And so that's how I think about it. I don't think it's, I don't think we're going to own everything or have personal data stores. I think it's a small intersection, but it is an impactful and important one.
Hi. So I came from the identity world, and now I'm in the ledger world. So I think the intersection is of interest. And I guess I suspect I'm supposed to find that every use case is applicable on a ledger of some form. But I'm not necessarily convinced about identity as the best way to use a ledger. And Damien in the previous talk highlighted this, that the value proposition of a ledger or a blockchain or a DLT is that you are disintermediating somebody. You're decentralizing influence and power. And that's valuable in a lot of use cases. But in so many identity use cases, just inherent is the idea is that there is an authority making identity statements, assertions, claims about users. So that there's a fundamental discontinuity there, I think, that hopefully we can explore today.
Adam.
Yeah, so I think I'd call the relationship between blockchain and identity dubious at best. I think most of the time, if you look at the use cases, they boil down to using blockchain as a registry, which is cool. It's a good registry. It's a good way to make a lot of people aware of and able to get your public keys. But there's a lot of other ways that we could do that. Probably a lot better.
Hi, everybody. Hello. Is this one on? I don't know if it is. If it's not, I'll use this one.
Now they're both on.
Now they're both on? Okay. I've spent a long, long time in identity, and before that I've been in standards and interoperability for even longer. And what I currently do is a lot of privacy and consent and authorization innovation, and I've always put an emphasis on making ecosystems work. So for individuals, people, organizations, and if you don't make all the parts work, then they can't work for individuals. And what I see in blockchain is mostly in this realm of identity plus that we're talking about, opportunities for privacy engineering techniques, and that's how it's being applied. And I think that we can easily, I see the temptation to oversell what it can do. And so I see opportunities for privacy engineering techniques. There's a whole application stack needed above that to do lots of other things that would be needed for success for wide-scale ecosystems.
Eve, tell us about that stack, just so that we all have that point of reference.
There's actually a picture that I kind of like that the Hedera blockchain and smart contracts discussion group put into its concluding report deliverable that has a blockchain layer. It has an IAM layer. It has an Alice on one side and a Bob on the other if you're looking for sharing of access to critical resources of interest that Alice has. That might include identity information. It might include other resources, digital assets. I like to dig into and see if we're really solving the problem.
David Fields, you are a venture capitalist. You invest in early stage companies and you have a focus on identity. And you have invested in a company that uses blockchain and identity.
Correct. So I invested in a company called Learning Machine. And they, along with, we're here in Boston, with MIT's Digital Currency Initiative, incubated something called the Blockcert Standard. And that's a standard for creating digital copies of academic records. And then it uses the blockchain, currently the Bitcoin blockchain, as a notary for those records. Blockchains aren't good for a lot, but they are good for recording that an event happened at a certain point in time. And so you can just think of that as a form of digital notary. For academic records, particularly when you're going across legal boundaries or legal jurisdictions, you have to have these records notarized to be recognized. And so that can be a 6 to 10 week process if you're lucky. If you're having them sent from the US to another jurisdiction for students in other places, that can be even longer. And so what they do is they have a product that allows issuing parties to create records, send them to their graduates or constituents or citizens, whomever they are, and now you can self-custody these records, and then it makes it a lot easier to share them. It reduces a lot of time and financial cost in that process. And so this is one specific narrow use case, and the thing that I think would be important to mention is that when these records are shared, you're still using other forms of proofing and verification of KYC, AML, credit background checks, criminal background checks. So it's not a replacement for any of those claims. It's something that actually works alongside it. And so it's narrow, but impactful.
Paul, does that fit your blockchain works when it disintermediates or disrupts?
To some extent. I came from the federated identity world of SAML and OpenID Connect, so I can't help but think about how that use case could be addressed with those protocols. To some extent, the blockchain is just, quote unquote, with application to identity, is just a different delivery channel of the identity claims, ones with different temporal implications. A claim is not created and spun up in real time, but rather a priori, with pros and cons and implications either way. We see that use case quite a bit, and there's value in that it does intermediate and thereby streamline some of the inefficiencies of the existing system. But as David highlighted, ultimately you still need trust between the issuing body and the relying party. And blockchain, is never going to provide a solution for that. Blockchain is great, as David highlighted, or ledgers in general, ordering events in history and everybody agreeing on those. Blockchain or ledgers in general says nothing about the truthfulness or credibility of the actual information within those events. And I think that highlights everything Eve said about the necessity of those other layers in the stack.
We need to disagree more here.
We will, I promise.
Where's all the fun we were having out in the hallway?
Sorry. Trust. Adam, can you talk about, so Paul mentioned trust and the relationships between what's on and off chain. Talk about governance as a layer, if you will, or the importance of governance in these systems.
Yeah, well, so that was one of the things that so I think the thing that struck me when I first got into stuff in 2016 when I did a report for DHS, and it was a security, basically I did a security assessment of identity on public blockchains. I used the Bitcoin blockchain. And the first thing I noticed, and what I put as the top attack on the report, was the 51% attack. And so the idea is that when more than half of entities control, when one entity controls more than half of the network, it's not effectively distributed. I mean, it's still distributed logically, but it doesn't. The power is consolidated. And if you think about it, we love to talk about the fact that these things, one of the magic things of the ledger is that it's not owned and therefore no one controls it. But the reality is that that's only going to ever be when it's really in its sweet spot. What I mean by that is if you, in my opinion, if you look at one of these systems, if it takes off and it's used, broadly and it's ubiquitously adopted, that will tend to consolidate power in fewer hands. Just look at the Bitcoin blockchain and how there's so few mining pools now, effectively a few different ones, if you add them up, comprise 51% of the hash power. And there's actually been a case where there was only one. And I think, on the way up and on the way down with these systems, the first one of these that becomes MySpace is going to become an exercise in consolidating power, and the first one of these that becomes Facebook is going to be a consolidation of power.
So we have our first disagreement. So there's different dynamics impact different ledger technologies. Proof of work, by its nature, has led to this centralization of pools of miners and centralization wherever electricity is cheap and it's cold. Iceland, Canada as an example. But not all ledgers confront those same issues. So not all ledgers, DLTs, face those same drivers towards centralization.
So that's great, because I'll disagree with that as well. Which is look, there's other the 51% attack has come to mean when one actor gains enough control of a hash power to rewrite a ledger. So you can do that technically by accumulating enough hardware to do that. The other way you can do that is insert political governance into and when I mean political governance, I mean human political governance into how the ledger is managed in and of itself. And so we need to be thoughtful when we compare, say, blockchain to permission ledgers, because they both are going to be vulnerable to 51% attacks. It's really a question of, are you more concerned about the accumulation of hardware, physical hash power, or are you concerned about regulatory capture and moral hazard, which of course is the cause of the financial crisis. And so when we compare some of these ledgers, I would just say, look, you need to be thoughtful about, are we actually solving something or just trading one problem for another that could even be worse?
I'm glad you're bringing that up, because I noticed a lot of security analyses focus kind of obsessively on the technical security attacks and miss what, I don't know, in the UMA group, we started calling them trust attacks. So we've been spending a lot of time on the UMA business model, and we talked about the BLT sandwich, so business, legal, technical, right? And there was a category of attacks we were theorizing that we call trust attacks, which is business incentives that can happen when you're talking about loosely coupleable services that might not be loosely coupled, things like that, which it's easy to sort of ignore if you're not thinking about the bigger business picture. And now that we are looking at this universe of governance models for trust frameworks and things, there's starting to be trust framework standards. This is above and beyond just blockchain context. I mean, there are trust framework standards in the world, a lot of them. I've worked on a meta model for that. We can start to be more cognizant of those challenges, but I sometimes think that security analyses do not fully take account of this. And that's a problem.
So you're saying that governance is a critical success factor for these new kinds of business models that use both permissioned and public blockchains.
Well, I mean, I actually think that centralization is the way of the business world. I don't see very many successful decentralized technologies over time. I mean, DNS, part of DNS is the only success story I can think of. I mean, where do people blog now? It's not in the main on their own blogs.
The purists would argue, though, that the technology has not existed ahead of blockchain or distributed consensus, and that distributed ledgers ultimately will enable this new model of decentralization to take flower, particularly around governance. I do see value in decentralized governance, but it's not a binary. It's not fully centralized, fully decentralized. It's a continuum, and there's trade-offs. There's efficiencies in centralization, right? The trains run on time under dictators, but clear trade-offs. So it's finding the sweet spot.
Isn't
And I mean that in a
decentralized governance an
technical sense.
oxymoron? I mean,
Decentralized
the
governance?
thing-
No.
we-
Governance is in this context, is a decision-making process about how the ledger should evolve. You know, all the minutia of what it means to run a public ledger requires someone to make decisions. The notable public ledgers that are out there now, Ethereum as the archetype, they are learning as they go about how to govern themselves, and full credit to them for being the first and learning as they go.
I think it's just, I mean, just to put a point on it, this is one of the things that bugs me is we fool ourselves into
Me?
thinking back, because the network's distributed, we have this sort of magic, egalitarian system. Well, the network can be distributed all at once, but if governance is sort of centralized by nature, and the more centralized it gets, what have you got?
Let me just jump in 1 second, because I think, we're talking about a couple different forms of governance, and we've seen, even in the permissionless space now, attempts to, through staking, other forms to have voting and governance on chain. I think one of the important things about that is unique about governance with the Bitcoin blockchain is that it's reduced the cost to exit. And so we've seen this with forks. And so if you want to have a bigger block size, if you want to do something different, you can fork it, you can galvanize a community. And you can actually belong to more than one community at the same time. And so this has really changed the notion of governance, which previously was about protesting and galvanizing change within a state or within a system. And now we can actually just fork it, run simultaneous experiments, and see who wins out in the end. And so I do think there actually is decentralized governance in a different way.
What would forking mean if identity were sitting in that ledger? What are the implications for the users of now two parallel worlds continuing on?
Well, Paul, fork you.
It would fork you, that's the answer.
Yes, the user would be forked.
You would be forked.
Paul, tell us
We
about...
can do this all day.
So let's wait, hang on for a second. So explain to the audience your view of forking, and then we'll let David...
So David portrayed a vision of forking where it enables this sort of evolutionary Cambrian explosion of diversity and growth. And sure, it has that potential, but it also creates great chaos and turmoil and churn and loss of network effect. And we're here in this room contemplating the idea of putting identity on top of that potentially chaotic, churn, forked system. And I think we should be careful about that.
Well, and that the vision of, kind of user-centric identity 2.0, if you will, has been so named self-sovereign identity. And it's meant to be a vision for what supposedly individuals want, what users want. I was reminiscing about, Paul, I had you out to talk about, well, it was user-centric identity at the time. Remember it was InfoCard and OpenID probably 10 years ago out in the UK. And those technologies failed at the time because I don't think they were responsive to what individuals really wanted. So if we're delivering what individuals really want in the market today out of these technologies and address fork, what does that mean for these poor people?
Fork you.
You're on.
So, look, so I think we deviated there for a second and maybe got a little bit away from, we have to be thoughtful. Are we talking about blockchain? Are we talking about identity-specific ledgers? Are we talking about identity, decentralized apps built on top of smart contracting platforms? And so maybe, we have to be careful, not just about the taxonomy of identity, but also the taxonomy of the ledgers. Because now we've kind of got two different axes that are intersecting that can lead to a very convoluted conversation. Where I was getting philosophical there, I was thinking much more about around forks. I was really speaking specifically to sort of the monetary use case. I think when you look at identity on the blockchain, I don't totally know what that means. I don't really actually agree with it for the most part when I hear people use it typically. But in the instance of the use case that I used, it's not like that record would then go away. I mean, that original ledger is still in existence, is still working, and so are we forking, what application? Is identity really its own specific protocol. I mean, there are protocols around specific components of identity, but is it actually a protocol holistically in and of itself requiring its own ledger? I mean, I think that's a very different conversation, and I think that's where I think most of us up here would say identity-specific ledgers, open source, maybe doesn't make as much sense.
I just have to add, just make note of the fact that if you had, so de facto, if you look today at governance to the extent it exists in the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency markets, that's the answer, right? You have a disagreement, you fork. And what happens with forks, right? People who all agree, right? You form two camps and you fork, and then you end up with two camps that are all really aligned, right? So it gets back to that point about consolidation of power.
In no public blockchain where a fork has occurred has those two subsequent camps been aligned. Inevitably, there is vitriol, hatred, constant attacks between them. It's a destruction of what might have been a community.
Okay, so look, the biggest instance of that, of course, is Bitcoin. And if you look at immediately after the fork, I think what Adam was saying is that the two separate camps individually were aligned. So you didn't have, there wasn't alignment across the camps.
Okay.
But actually, if you look at how, since we're now getting back into trading levels of cryptocurrencies, actually post-fork last year, when you forked into Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, immediately if you held Bitcoin pre-fork, you had more value in fiat terms post-fork. And so there wasn't a destruction of value, and it's questionable whether there was actually a destruction of network effect. But right now you have more money, even with the 70% decline or whatever it is, you have like 6 times more money in US dollar terms than you did pre-fork. Not that I'm counting.
I would just like to maybe comment, bring it to the identity use case, which is, I think, at the center of our topic here today. People want convenience and value out of applications they interact with, out of services that they interact with. And, I think they do appreciate network effects when it comes to social applications, and that's why I don't think a lot of people hashtag deleted Facebook. I've taken 2 steps back from it myself, whatever that's worth. But if some disruption like this happened, for one, or such other disruptions as might happen, some of the business risks and security risks we're talking about, they would flee. And if Facebook were to suddenly fork or something like it, its value would halve or quarter or whatever. What would be the point?
So the notion of forking came in this umbrella of governance. Would you all agree that the governance of these systems, these DLT blockchain systems that are trying to solve some identity problem, is a critical part of that success?
That's a risk.
Yes.
Yeah.
EOS is a ledger that's just launched, and they are confronting the growing pains of governance right now.
So give me another example of governance, David. As an investor, do you look at governance before you invest?
Always. That's what an investor rights agreement is. I think what I think about when I look at whether somebody's building on blockchain or distributed ledger right now, whatever they're using, I think a critical thing is to look at is sort of are the multiple stakeholders involved in the ecosystem and the governance aligned with how economic value and social value will actually be distributed. So that's kind of like just investing 101 for me. And I always check to see where the divergence is, and do you have professed values that don't really map to the architecture of the system itself.
Adam, can you talk about self-sovereign and the notion of identity and sovereignty in the blockchain?
Yeah, so I took a look at that as well as part of the work I did. The biggest thing that struck me about self-sovereign identity is the idea that if you sort of take it at face value, the idea is that it seemingly creates liberty. When you really dig into it, it just occurred to me at one point, it doesn't. It just assumes it. And so I think, there's a lot of this idea that, you achieve this user centricity and we reign supreme over our own identities. But, when you're at the fringes, when you're either, maybe an old person who's relying on somebody like a child to, make decisions for them, or whether you're, a refugee in a camp somewhere, you don't have liberty. That system falls down really quickly, and if you really think about it, you can think up some pretty scary scenarios where it's really anything but self-sovereign.
I do apologize for a lack of time to take questions from you. So what I'm going to do is ask each of our panelists if they could give you, the audience, an important takeaway from this discussion about the intersection of identity systems at scale and blockchain and distributed ledger technology. Who'd like to go first? Eve? I believe you have a song that you're going to be singing the other night. No.
Well, I'll be singing on Wednesday night. I hope people make it to the closing party. There won't be a blockchain song as far as I know. Do identity references.
Multiple versions.
Well, just working things, I suppose. I'll just comment about the whole notion of controlling. I like what Adam just said about assuming liberty. The notion of controlling your identity is a big part, I think, of the self-sovereign discussion. And I talked about this application stack that's required in addition to blockchain technology to make the vision work. I think there's risk in assuming that controlling, granting access to your digital assets is part of that vision without a whole bunch of other work to do there. That's a lot of what I spend time on. I mentioned authorization and consent. And that's a big part of what needs to be solved. There's people that's gone on for a long time to solve it. And I don't shy away from centralization if it's needed there, to be honest. I think it's needed to solve a comprehensive vision.
Immutability is presented as this unvarnished good of blockchains, and in lots of use cases it's valuable. In identity, it's tough. GDPR, right to be forgotten, it's really hard to reconcile that and sort of the higher level privacy principle that it's meant to protect with immutability. So I'll leave you with that.
I'd just say, looking at the space over the last few years, there's a lot of really cool stuff happening. And I'd point out, distributed identifiers and verifiable claims, and it's all really cool. And that stuff, actually, that's the thing that interested me the most. It was that stuff. I'm with it right up until the part where it's put it on the blockchain. I just don't see why that's even necessary. So I think, if we look at this space, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's also bolstered, crypto. I'm going to talk tomorrow where I'm going to bring up an idea that I would have got laughed at a few years ago because it involves crypto. Now it's a palatable idea to a lot of people, and I think that's in part because of the work that's been done in blockchain and DLT. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but let's think really hard about what actually belongs on a ledger and why.
I think I'm probably the most bullish on the permissionless space of anybody on the panel. I think that's probably an understatement. But one thing we didn't get to really is talking about key management. And if you actually, so Bitcoin is supposedly digital gold or digital store value, but to really secure it properly, we have to give it its own hardware wallet, a physical form factor, and disconnect it from the internet. If you look at people who actually hold a lot of Bitcoin, in many instances, what they're doing is they're storing it on servers that are like a mile below the earth, guarded, in vaults guarded by like Swiss guards with assault rifles. And so I think if you just follow what's actually happening with people who have value at risk at stake, what it says is that key management is a huge problem, and it's just not really ready for any sort of high velocity, high frequency use, certainly not by mass consumers.
So I wanted to thank David, Adam, Paul, and Eve. Invite all of you to keep watching the governance piece of these new highly decentralized, multi-jurisdictional, self-regulatory bodies called blockchain. So I hope to see you back next year. We'll see how all this stuff is shaken out. Thank you very much, and a hand for our panelists.